Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm your host, Brandon Busteed, Chief Partnership Officer and Global Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And I'm really excited to have a terrific guest here with me today, Walter Kimbrough, who's the president of Dillard University. We were just talking. He's now entering into his 10th year as president of Dillard. And we're going to be talking about the future of historically Black colleges and universities today. Walter, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about your background and about Dillard.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm a preacher's kid, native of Atlanta. Thought I was going to be a veterinarian. Went to University of Georgia because they have a great vet school. Got in vet school early. Then realized I don't want to be a veterinarian. But I was involved on campus and had a chance to talk to a college president and said, "Hey, I think I might want to do this." And he sort of put me on the path. When I was 21, going to grad school, saying, "Hey, I want to be a college president," and became one in 2004. So that's the path and how I got here.
That's terrific. Yeah, and it's you usually in these stories, every time somebody shares it, there's a mentor in the frame, right? Somebody who encouraged it or pointed it out to you. So you're sharing in that mentorship as part of that story. And tell us a little bit more about Dillard. Obviously, a longstanding historically Black college, and just tell us a little bit more about it.
Right. So Dillard was like a lot of institutions after the end of slavery. People were looking for ways to create opportunities to educate these newly freed people. There were two schools founded in New Orleans by two different religious groups, the Methodists, which back then were Methodist Episcopal, now United Methodist Church, and American Missionary Association, which is now the United Church of Christ. They created two little schools a couple weeks from each other in 1869. And then by 1930, you had the General Board of Education out in New York and several local philanthropists and people like Julius Rosenwald all jumping in to say, these two little schools can't work like this. Let's pull them together. They formed Dillard in 1930 and opened this campus in 1935. So it was a really great collaboration from a lot of different people to create this institution that's always been very diverse. We serve about half of the students come from Louisiana, but students really from all across the country. The oldest nursing program in the state, the oldest speech and theater program for any HBCU. We have signature programs in physics and film and pre-law. So there are a lot of different traditional liberal arts institutions. So you got an interest in something, and Dillard really does a pretty good job in a lot of different things.
Yeah, pretty amazing stuff, and I appreciate the backdrop and the history of it. Obviously, we're in an interesting time to say the least, right? We're hopefully coming out of a pandemic. Obviously, still a lot of concerns on that front. Last year was a brutal year on so many different levels, pandemic being one of them, but a lot of racial strife, political discord. A culminating moment for the Black Lives Matter movement. There's just been a lot going on. And but at the same time, thankfully, there's a lot of sun shining on HBCUs right now, right? So some major philanthropic gifts led by, the likes of the Mackenzie Scotts of the world. And it seems like a lot of increasing growing interest and popularity for HBCUs. Tell me a little bit about what you've been seeing in the landscape and what Dillard specifically may have been experiencing to that effect.
Well, so I tell people I think this is phase two of this renewed interest in HBCUs. I think the first phase started in 2015 when what I call the Missouri effect. That after you had the trials and tribulations at the University of Missouri, for the next 12 months. And a lot of institutions all across the country, you had Black students, stepping up and saying, things aren't right here. What's going on? You had lots of protests, those kinds of things. And I think that was a time when students and families started to say, let's look broader at, what's going on. You start to see some research come out around that time. We were talking earlier about the Gallup study about HBCUs. That was in the fall of 2015 as well. So that was the first edge of this where people started looking. And that's when you start to see applications and enrollments at a number of HBCUs go up at the time. It wasn't up as fast because I think a lot of people said, well, over the last 10 years, HBCU enrollment has actually declined numerically, but it hasn't declined at the same rate that Black student enrollment has declined. So actually, the percentage of Black students attending HBCUs actually ticked up a couple years ago. So the overall issue is still pretty bad, that we have fewer Black students in higher ed, and we've got to have that conversation. But of the fewer, more are choosing HBCUs. So that started it. I think then, particularly within the last 4 years, and then going into the election season with Kamala Harris, that's a part of it. With the George Floyd effect, you had people trying to figure out, how do we address issues of race? They started reading Ibram Kendi, who graduated from FAMU. They started reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, who went to Howard. You started to see a new wave of Black mayors who were HBCU grads in New Orleans and Atlanta and Montgomery and Birmingham and St. Paul. You have all those things that are happening at the same time. You got Stacey Abrams in Georgia getting people elected. You have Raphael Warnock. So you add all these things together, and you're talking about HBCU grads on the national stage very prominently every day. And so it brings us now to phase 2. And you throw in there, Beyonce did a performance that was patterned after, Beyonce does it, everybody's talking about it. So you throw that in there. So over the last 6 years, there have been a lot of things. So it's not just, the summer of George Floyd or Kamala Harris. I trace it back to 2015. And so it's exposure, it's research. There are a lot of things that have really put a new spotlight. And so I think what I always tell people, just look at the options. It's not saying everybody needs to go to an HBCU, but there are some folks who would be better served at the HBCU that didn't even consider it as an option. And that's what has happened. Yeah,
and it's great to see that. And first of all, that was a terrific summary of a lot of the different drivers of interest and visibility. And I'm really glad that you walked it back to 2015 as well, because first of all, I agree with you. And as you know, right, I was involved when I was at Gallup in leading that study that came from the larger Gallup Purdue Index, but specifically had enough data of Black graduates from HBCUs to kind of look at how HBCUs, how well those institutions were serving those students. And on one hand, right, I don't know that it was a surprise that the outcome of that was very clear research that they're serving these graduates very well. But what was, I think, just a pleasant surprise was when you compare the outcomes of Black graduates from an HBCU compared to Black graduates from a PWI, the differences are astoundingly better and in favor of the graduate from the HBCU. And so, look, although there might be some new visibility, kind of around the HBCU experience, they've long been institutions that have performed from a value of education and supportive service, supportive student perspective. In fact, the things that they were off the charts on were graduates saying things like they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams, a professor who made them excited. They were even double the national average of saying they had a job or internship during college where they were applied with their learning. So, there's great evidence that these institutions have served students well. I don't know that that was always out there in more of a public visible setting, but you're right. 2015 on, there's been so much support there. And I'm glad you kind of referenced the data of, relatively speaking, more Black students enrolling in HBCUs than ever before. But you're right, we still have huge equity and access issues, right? I forget the stat I just read recently about, the unbelievably low number of male African Americans who are going to med school. I mean, it's lower than in 1972, I think. I mean, you might know better, but a lot of work left to do. Yeah, that's been one of the studies I cite a lot. And I was talking to the president of Meharry Medical College, who really talked about this study that said that there were more Black men in medical school in 1978 than there were in 2017. And it's like, how, and I kept, when I meet with counselors and parents, I just use a numbers analogy. It's to say, okay, so what's different? So from those times, 1978 to 2000, I think it's 2015, there were twice as many Black men in higher education. The percent that were going to HBCUs was half of that. So more people are going to what people thought were better schools. So why is the outcome worse? And that's when people have to start asking the question. It's like, look, it's like if Steph Curry takes twice as many 3-pointers and he makes less of them,
people are going to be like, what is wrong with him? He's making fewer shots and he took twice as many. So it's the same thing. It's like you got twice as many people and they're not at HBCUs. You can't say they're going to these inferior schools and they're not going to HBCUs. They're going to what people thought are better schools and your outcomes are worse. And that when I put it like that, people are saying, okay, we need to look at this differently. So even there are institutions that don't have the same level of resources, they're overperforming in a lot of different areas. The same kind of data also replicated for those going to law school. We see the same thing happening. So that's why I keep telling people, find a place that's a good fit for you and you can be successful there, but don't have it in your mind automatically, oh, it's an HBCU, it's an inferior institution, because that has gotten people messed up.
Yep. Yeah. So one of my favorite shows I mentioned is to you before we came on live, but our family's been watching All American, right? Which is, loosely based on a true story. And the latest episode, these are high school students who went and visited a fictitious HBCU in the movie in Atlanta. And, the whole thing was about, wow, I would have never considered an HBCU. I really think this is a fit for me, right? So this is even being exposed in a very real way from a Hollywood perspective. And so I'd love to, ask you about a couple things, in terms of, where you see the future of HBCUs going. I mean, one is a specific example of what Dillard's doing. So you guys just launched a new Center for Racial Justice. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I see a number of those efforts happening, but tell us what you guys have been doing at Dillard on that front.
Right. So there have been a lot since last summer of people saying, what can we do to help address these issues and learn more about them? And I think the unique thing for Dillard is that last year, a lawsuit that the Maryland HBCUs filed against the state of Maryland was settled for $577 million. The lead attorney on that is my board chair, and he's a Dillard alum. So he's just been having these conversations because he's been dealing with this for a decade. And he was like, Dillard, we could do something related to this. And so, it's the lead faculty person is a criminologist. So we've really looked a lot at issues of crime, issues of working with policing, those kind of things. And so they've done a lot of, forums so far to really start thinking about how we're going to, build this out. We're going to get some grants to really do some things in terms of internships for students to help do some training in the city and those kind of things. So we're excited about a lot of possibilities and even make it sort of multidisciplinary to address other issues as well. But right now we're in the phase where we're working with foundations, and, next couple of months, we'll announce a couple of major, 7-figure gifts toward this center. So we're really excited about that. But I think a lot of people are saying this is the time to have those kind of conversations and to be engaged in that work. So we participate in that too.
Yeah, and obviously some of it's going to benefit the students that are there at Dillard, but obviously provide to a broader conversation in the community and even at a regional and national scale, I'm sure. And a great example of what some of this new philanthropic interest is being put towards, right? So so I'm curious, what are some of the other either initiatives that you've seen other HBCUs heading towards, or ones that you guys are hopeful you'll be able to do?
Well, so I think one of the things, particularly in this time that we're in, and I haven't been to a good national meeting yet, so one out in September, we'll have this conversation with some folks in the HBCU space, is how does everybody leverage this heightened visibility and interest in HBCUs? Because part of the concern that people will have is that it's tilted toward a small segment that's getting a lot of attention, a lot of funding. And there are 100 schools, so there's still, a good 60 or 70 that haven't gotten anything. And people don't know those schools exist. So how do they start thinking about how do we leverage, the moment to really catch that wave, to be part of it? And then those that are fortunate enough to get those resources, how do they make sure that people do know other institutions exist as well? So I think that's a part of, so you don't have an even wider gap between the haves and have-nots. I mean, you have that in all of higher education. I mean, you just have that in the country. So It's replicated even within the HBCU ecosystem. But I think people got to really start thinking about, we're doing it at Dillard, and I think we get a significant number of press, and, I do a lot of interviews with folks. So, we're not completely unknown, but we're even working to figure out, how do we improve our brand position? How do we get more people to know about the things that we're doing here in New Orleans? How do we leverage being in one of 4 cities that has 3 HBCUs and working with Suno and Xavier, that we, form our own little, version of like Atlanta has an Atlanta University Center, to do something like that here in New Orleans. So
Yeah.
those are the strategic conversations I think that people have to use in this moment that exists. I'm thinking of this time, and the interest in HBCUs will last for a longer period, but it's hot right now. So how do we all figure out, our place, and to make sure we get the right kind of attention? I think that's the work that has to be done, and we just can't let it pass. And like I said, there are some institutions that haven't gotten nothing. So people don't even know those schools exist. So there has to be some work that's done for those institutions, and things they can probably learn from some of the other institutions that will be helpful.
Yeah. So your point's a good one about there isn't even visibility across, the 100 plus HBCUs that are out there, and but there certainly is an opportunity for collaboration and a tide that helps rise all boats. One of the big pieces of news in the last couple of weeks was Tony Allen, the president of Delaware State, who's actually on our Graham Holdings board of directors. Delaware State just acquired Wesley College. Right. And it was officially the first HBCU acquisition of a non-HBCU. So, there's a big, interesting move. Do you see things like that happening more, or was that just kind of a unique happenstance there in Delaware?
Yeah, it's, the closest thing to that is that when the state of Georgia did some consolidations for 4-year institutions and 2-year institutions, Albany, Georgia essentially acquired Darden College, which was a 2-year school started in the 60s. So there were 2 schools in the same system. Darden was maybe a slightly predominantly white, but it was very diverse. Albany State, historically Black. So when they merged those 2, it became Albany State. So we do have an example of that happening, but this is different with a public institution and a private. But, Delaware State having the support of the state of Delaware makes it, I think, feasible to do that, where some places might not be able to have the capital to do that. The state of Delaware could do it, and it made sense for the entire state to do this. So I think you had a good partnership that was a win for everybody going around. So in a situation like that, I think that works really well. There could be some others like that. I don't know. This is, it was just surprising that happened, but there might be some places where that could happen as well. A lot of times, particularly other HBCUs have been hesitant to that, but there are some that are geographically situated where that could be a possibility. I just don't know if people would consider that.
Yeah, no, certainly. Yeah, I'll be interested to, watch how it unfolds. And, Delaware State's ambition is to grow enrollment significantly, and so, certainly thinking about it in a number of different ways, but it was, a great story and a lot of higher ed attention on it. So just curious to get your thoughts about it. And, one of the other, interesting ideas that I was thinking about with some of my team members was the concept of like, we've got a decent percentage of students across the US, especially in, kind of the private institution, higher ranked institutions who go study abroad, right? Study abroad as like a signature experience for them. And there's a lot of reasons to do it. But, one of the things I was thinking about is there an opportunity now to think about providing opportunities for students, say from a predominantly white institution, or let's just say a non-HBCU, to spend a semester at an HBCU. I even think about, I'm a Duke graduate, right? And NCCU is right down the street in Durham, and they've done some collaboration, but we've got buses that bus students for programs between Duke and UNC. Right. I don't know that we have the same thing going on between Duke and NCCU. Maybe there is, and I just don't know about it. But I'm just curious, like, are ideas like that going to be more valuable, where you just get more students exposure to things like initiatives you have going on for the Center for Racial Justice? And so I spend a semester at Dillard, and that's part of my focus. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, those kinds of programs have really existed for years. Ruth Simmons, who is the president of Prairie View now, who is president of Brown, she was a student at Dillard, and she talked about spending a semester. I can't think of what school in the Northeast that she did, but she had that experience. So those kind of programs have existed. People haven't done as many of those in recent years, but there might be an interest to do those kinds of exchange programs again. That's a win for everybody. I think all those students learn from those opportunities. So I haven't heard a lot of people talk. We're still trying to get out of COVID, but afterwards, maybe people will do more of those. But that's not a new thing. People have done them, and HBCUs have done them, 50, 60 years. I mean, so those programs have existed.
Yeah.
And I think there probably is going to be an appetite for more of those kinds of programs.
Yeah, I would sure love to see stuff like that, and that's the kind of thing I would love to see. My kids are young, but when they get to college, right, those are the kinds of experiences that I think would be incredible for them. Certainly would endorse that from a parental perspective. So, one of the things I wanted to touch on, this gets into the K12 world, right? One of the other, it was hard for me to believe the news story when I saw it, but it's true. Our K12 schools as of today are as segregated now as any time in the history since we went through desegregation, right, of schools. So, I mean, look, and we know there's a lot of factors driving that. There's a whole bunch to unpack there, but like, on one hand, I think that's a really sad statement, right? That's where we are some, half a century later. But like, what are the implications of that? I mean, are you thinking about like, what does segregated schools at the K12 level mean for higher ed? And, how do we, like, are we stuck in this? I mean, what are the ways we get out of that kind of a trap?
Yeah, it's always an interesting conversation. I mean, having lived in Little Rock and worked at a place that's literally 1 mile down the street from Central High School. I've had a lot of conversations about this. And I think actually when they did the 50th anniversary report of Brown versus Board, I think Harvard did it. They had already talked about that we had moved back to, at Brown versus, Board days in terms of school segregation. So I briefly saw there was a recent report that you mentioned about that. I think the challenge is that it's just how we live in our day-to-day lives that it is so segregated in terms of day-to-day. So I know a lot of times people say, well, why do we have HBCUs that are segregated? It's like, no, we have people who live in segregated communities. We go to segregated churches. They go to segregated schools. And then out of the blue, you want higher ed to get rid of HBCUs so then people can go back and repeat the cycle. That was like, you got to deal with it on different levels. So I think there are ways that people have to figure out, how do we find ways to interact and engage with people who are different than us. And, sometimes HBCUs are an easy target, but I always tell people the faculty at HBCUs are much more diverse than faculties at predominantly white institutions. So I could go to the University of Georgia for 4 years and a quarter and never have a Black faculty member. There is no student who comes to Dillard who cannot have a white faculty member. Okay, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So there is a diversity there, so that people just sort of, negate all the time. And these are the people who are become your mentors and instructors and all those kinds of things that, it gets left to the side. So I don't know. We've got to find ways for people to engage with each other. And I think, as we talked about earlier, some of these exchange programs would help, to partner in local areas to do things together. But people have to be intentional about the spaces that they find. And, I'm a member of a church. There were 2 churches that merged after Katrina, a Black United Methodist church and a white church. They merged, and today is still a very diverse church, and it's probably 50-50. And that's where I go, and my son goes to a school that, they're only private boys Catholic school, and, he's in the minority. My daughter's at a very diverse school. So it's like they get to see lots of different people. People have to think about that.
Yeah, well, there's a neat story about the church merger. So that, it created a more diverse opportunity for everybody. It sounds like, but yeah, you're right. I mean, intentionality, I think, is the right word to use. I mean, that happens at an individual level, right? We have to be intentional and do things like decide what we want to read and whether we want to live in an echo chamber of social media and close off our circles to only the opinions we want to hear and not the ones that, we need to engage. So there's a lot of challenges ahead, and opportunities too for higher ed, right? To create those opportunities for students, to create safe places, but also places that challenge them and, kind of push them outside of, their comfort zones and the typical interactions that they, otherwise would have if they weren't intentional about it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious on that point, are you guys thinking about any changes in, the core curriculum or new programs that you're going to launch in terms of academic programs? Is that part of what you're thinking about too?
I haven't a lot because, for me, the programs that we have, and there's a lot of that. People roll out new programs every day. It's like, we got a new master's in this, we got a new. It's like, yeah, but the things that you do already, are they good? And
Yeah.
that's, I always start with like, have you really looked at what you're doing right now? Because it's like you can add stuff to say, "Ooh, everybody's doing cyber. Let's do cyber now." Okay, let's. Everybody's doing, whatever else. Let's do that too. It seems sort of bandwagony to me, and I think you have
Yeah.
to go back and look fundamentally to say, why are you adding new things when the things that you're doing you aren't doing well? So I want to make sure that the things that we're doing well, that you do those well, they're excellent. If you can't do that excellent, then you get rid of that and then do something else that's new. But
Yeah.
whatever you're doing, it should be excellent. And I think people fool themselves just to say, well, this is going to attract new students, so let's just add this program on this. It's like, yeah, the things that you're doing right now aren't good. So
Yeah.
that's a hard conversation, and people don't want to hear that. But that's the way I look at it. I don't get excited when people say, well, we need new programs and this and that. It's like, no, what are you going to get rid of? You're just trying to increase your bandwidth, but you haven't demonstrated excellence in what you're doing. And that to me is problematic.
Yeah, that's a really important point because you're right. Usually the instinct is just keep adding programs,
Yep.
right? And it doesn't mean that you're delivering on the core ones that were already there, or
Right.
there might be programs that really are underperforming. Like either make sure they're great or cut those, right?
Yeah.
Higher ed never likes to, it's add,
Yeah.
never, but like to focus on the quality of those offerings. And then maybe one of the points we can end on, as we were getting close to time, is just something we were talking about again before we went live. Was the special experience that Dillard provided to students during the pandemic, right? So I asked you the question, hey, what are you doing in the online world? Are you doing any big things online? And maybe you can just, tell the audience what you said to me earlier.
Yeah, no, we really made the decision based on some surveys that we would be open all of last year. So people are talking about reopening. We never closed, and we didn't have fully online. We had people on campus. We normally might house close to 900 students. We housed over 600 students.
Wow.
We were able to do, individual rooms, single rooms, and then we partnered with a local institution, Southern University, New Orleans, which built housing after Katrina, but they're a commuter institution, so they have plenty of open beds. So we could do the distancing in terms of rooms, which is great. We did hybrid model so that classes would be like Monday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday. You would be in person one day and online the other day. And then we did more in person then for spring semester. But that's what our students said very clearly in the research that we did, that we want to be on campus. I personally did focus groups with students, faculty, staff, and parents. And I even had one parent who says, look, I have comorbidities, but I watched my daughter and how she grew in that freshman year at Dillard. She needs to be there. And they didn't have any hesitations. And we had a great year. We didn't have a whole lot of cases. We didn't have any nobody went to the hospital. So, that was really good. So everybody worked together. The seniors wanted to be on campus because they wanted to have a graduation, which we were able to do our traditional graduation. That was great. But we heard that loud and clear from everybody. Everybody bought it, because you heard some places faculty said, we feel like I talked to faculty, and some who were hesitant, one who said, I'm gonna teach online, then came back later and said, no, I need to be in person. So they really bought into the mission about what we were trying to do. I appreciate that. I think that was to me a powerful year to have so many people say, yep, I know it's a pandemic. I know there's some challenges and some risks, but we're going to do everything we can do to be safe. But we know that there's some magic that happens when we're in this space together.
Yeah, well, I think that's an awesome way to close the conversation, which has been a really fun one. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and ideas and experiences, Walter. I wish you great luck with what I hope becomes a very successful year and years to come on the philanthropy front. And I know you're getting ready to gear up for a big visit to alumni. So anyhow, thanks for your great leadership, and really appreciate you joining us today.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. We'll look forward to catching you again next week. Thanks so much for tuning in.